The ocean does not forgive hesitation. On the 21st of October, in the year 1805, somewhere off the southwestern coast of Spain, near a rocky headland the locals called Cabo de Trafalgar, the world held its breath. The wind was light that morning, barely enough to fill a sail, and the sea ran in long, slow swells that rocked the great warships like cradles. But there was nothing peaceful about what was gathering on that water. 33 ships of the line, flying the combined flags of France and Spain, stretched across the horizon in a crescent so vast it seemed to scrape the edges of the world. Aboard them stood nearly 30,000 men. Soldiers, sailors, gunners, boys who had never seen home again after the press gangs took them. Their cannons, more than 2,000 of them, sat loaded and waiting behind closed gun ports. The smell of slow match and salt and fear hung over everything like a second sky, and sailing toward them, directly toward them, not parallel, not cautiously, but straight into the teeth of that crescent, came 27 British ships, fewer guns, and yet every man in that fleet knew they were going to win. Admiral Horatio Nelson stood on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, a ship so ancient in her bones and so legendary in her reputation that her name alone sent tremors through enemy fleets. He was a small man by any measure, one eye lost to a fragment of stone at Calvi, one arm gone above the elbow at Tenerife, and yet those who sailed under him would have followed him into the sun itself if he'd asked. He wore his admiral's coat with all its decorations visible, the stars and medals glinting in the pale October light, a target any marksman could see from 100 yards. His officers begged him to remove them. He refused. Nelson always refused. The signal flags climbed the mast. 31 letters, arranged by a young lieutenant following the admiral's instruction. When the message broke across the fleet, it did not say what generals say. It did not speak of duty to the crown or the punishment for retreat. It said simply, "England expects that every man will do his duty." And then the guns opened up, and the world came apart. The combined fleet fired first. Broadside after broadside tore the water white, threw splinters the length of a man through gun crews, dropped masts, shredded canvas, punched holes through oak 2 feet thick. The British ships could not fire back as they came in bow first. They could only sail forward and absorb it. Men died in silence at their stations, blown apart before they could say a word, and the men beside them stepped over what remained and kept their eyes ahead. This was the arithmetic of Nelson's navy. Pain was a price to be paid. The killing would come later. When HMS Victory finally broke the enemy line, running between the Bucentaur and the Redoutable at pistol range, she unleashed a single broadside through the stern windows of the French flagship that killed or wounded nearly 400 men in a single instant. The entire stern gallery dissolved in smoke and fire and flying wood. The decks below looked, as one survivor described it, like a slaughterhouse after a night of work. But on the upper deck of the Redoutable, a French sharpshooter in the mizzentop had been waiting. He found his target in the open, the small man with the decorations and the empty sleeve. The ball entered Nelson's left shoulder, angled down through his lung and lodged in his spine. He fell to the deck and knew immediately from the feeling in his legs that he would not rise again. His secretary and a Marine officer carried him below into the dim, red-painted world of the surgeon's cockpit, where the sounds of the battle came to him muffled and distant, like thunder behind mountains. He lay there for 3 hours as his fleet destroyed everything before them. When they told him at last that victory was secured, that 15 enemy ships had been taken or destroyed, that the combined fleet of France and Spain would never sail together again, Nelson whispered words that have been debated and treasured ever since. Some say he said, "Thank God I have done my duty." Some say he said more. But what is certain is that by 4:30 in the afternoon, the greatest sailor Britain ever produced was dead, and the last challenge to British mastery of the oceans had been shattered beyond repair. What followed was not merely victory. It was something far larger than victory. It was the final seal on a century of struggle, innovation, blood, and iron. It was the confirmation of something that an island people had been building toward for 300 years, a dominion of the sea so absolute, so entrenched, so deeply woven into the fabric of the world that it would define the next century of human history. But Nelson did not create that dominion. He inherited it, perfected it, and died for it. The story of how it came to be is longer, stranger, and more desperate than any single battle. It begins not with triumph, but with terror. Because before Britain ruled the waves, Britain nearly drowned in them. To understand the rise of British naval power, you have to understand what Britain was before it had one. Step back 3 centuries before Trafalgar to an island nation sitting at the cold northwestern edge of the known world, and you find not a superpower, but a secondary player. A kingdom of moderate size, moderate wealth, and moderate ambitions, surrounded by water it could not fully control and threatened by powers it could not fully match. The England of the early 16th century was not a naval empire. It was a country that occasionally won battles at sea by luck, by weather, and by the desperate courage of men who had no other choice. The great continental powers, Spain, Portugal, France, were the ones building empires. It was the Portuguese who had cracked open the sea routes to India and the Far East, who had turned the African coastline into a chain of trading stations, who had mapped the winds and currents that the rest of Europe would eventually follow. It was Spain that had stumbled into the Americas and found a world so rich in gold and silver that it transformed the entire global economy. And it was France that sat directly across a narrow strip of water from England, perpetually ambitious, perpetually dangerous, perpetually reminding the English that geography alone would not protect them. England had ships, but ships in this era were not the sleek, purposeful instruments of war they would later become. They were awkward, high-castled, enormously built things called carracks and galleons, more like floating fortresses than warships, designed to carry soldiers who would fight hand-to-hand after grappling the enemy. Sea battles in the early 16th century looked more like land battles conducted on a wet surface. You crashed into your enemy. You threw ropes and hooks, you boarded. You killed with swords and pikes and the occasional arquebus. Gunnery was an afterthought. Seamanship was barely a science. And the idea that a navy might be a permanent, professional institution, funded by the state and maintained in peacetime as well as war, had barely begun to take root anywhere in Europe. Henry VIII changed that, though perhaps not entirely for the reasons historians most celebrate him. Henry was vain, violent, and possessed of appetites that consumed everything around him. But he was also genuinely fascinated by ships. He built, he spent, he launched warships of a size England had never attempted. His great ship, the Henri Grâce à Dieu, known to sailors simply as Great Harry, was enormous beyond precedent, bristling with guns on multiple decks, a statement of royal power made in wood and iron and canvas. She was followed by the Mary Rose, smaller but beautifully built, and by dozens of other vessels that together formed the nucleus of what would eventually become the Royal Navy. But Henry's ships were still creatures of the old tactical world. They carried too much superstructure, too many guns mounted too high, too many soldiers who had no real business being at sea. The Mary Rose famously and tragically capsized and sank during a French raid in the Solent in 1545, probably because her gun ports were left open when she heeled in a sudden squall and the sea simply poured in through them. She went down so fast that the netting rigged over her upper decks to prevent enemy boarders trapped most of her crew as she sank. 500 men drowned within sight of the English shore, within sight of Henry himself watching from the shore. It was a devastating lesson in the gap between ambition and capability. The real transformation came not in a single reign or a single decade, but through a slow, grinding process of learning. Learning from failure, learning from rivals, and learning from the sea itself, which is the harshest teacher that has ever existed. English sailors began to venture further. English merchants, hungry for the spices and silks and profits that the Spanish and Portuguese had monopolized, began to fund voyages of exploration and trade. And English privateers, men who were technically pirates when nobody was watching and technically authorized raiders when the crown needed them, began to test the defenses of the Spanish Empire in ways that were audacious to the point of madness. Francis Drake was among the most audacious. You have to pause with Drake for a moment because he is one of those historical figures who becomes so legendary that it is easy to forget how genuinely frightening he must have been to encounter. He was a Devon man, raised on the waterfront, who went to sea in his teens and never really came back to land. By his 30s, he had sailed to the Caribbean and back, had survived storms and ambushes and the treachery of Spanish governors, and had developed a hatred for Spanish power, so deep and so personal that it shaped everything he did. In 1572, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama on foot, literally walked across Central America, and climbed a tall tree on a ridge from which, on a clear day, you could see both the Atlantic and the Pacific simultaneously. He stood there looking at the Pacific and told God that he hoped someday to sail an English ship on that ocean. 6 years later, he did it. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe, from 1577 to 1580, was not primarily a voyage of exploration. It was a raid. A 3-year planet-spanning raid against Spanish colonial possessions, conducted with a small fleet that he progressively lost to storms and mutiny and desertion until he came home in a single ship. Golden Hind, so stuffed with captured Spanish treasure that her ballast was replaced with silver ingots. Queen Elizabeth personally received him on the deck of his ship at Deptford and knighted him on the spot. The Spanish called him El Drac and considered him a devil. The fact that he was, from their perspective, absolutely right did not make it any easier to deal with him. But Drake and the other Elizabethan sea dogs, Hawkins, Frobisher, Raleigh, were not simply colorful adventurers. They were, whether they knew it or not, the laboratory in which England's naval future was being invented. John Hawkins, in particular, who served as Treasurer of the Navy from 1577 onwards, looked at the ships England was building and saw everything that was wrong with them. He understood, in a way that most of his contemporaries did not, that the future of sea warfare was not boarding and hand-to-hand combat. It was gunnery, range, maneuverability, the ability to stand off from your enemy, wear him down with cannon fire, and destroy him before he could ever lay hands on you. Hawkins redesigned the English fighting ship from the keel up. He lowered the forecastles that made the old high-charge carracks so unstable in a seaway. He lengthened the hulls to give more space for guns and to improve sailing performance. He made ships that were faster, more responsive to the helm, and, crucially, capable of keeping their guns to windward even in a strong blow. The Navy that emerged from his reforms was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before. It was a weapons platform first, and everything else second. If you want to know what that meant in practice, think about what happened in 1588 when Philip II of Spain assembled the most powerful naval force in the world and sent it north to destroy England. The Spanish Armada is one of the most examined episodes in naval history, and for good reason. It was the first genuine test of the new English naval doctrine against the best that the Old World could assemble. Philip's fleet was enormous, 130 ships, nearly 20,000 soldiers and sailors, enough artillery to reduce any English port to rubble. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army waiting in the Spanish Netherlands, transport that army across to England, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore Catholic rule to an island that Philip considered to be rightfully within his sphere of influence. It was a plan that should have worked, and it failed in ways that nobody on either side fully anticipated. The English fleet under Lord Howard of Effingham, with Drake as his vice-admiral, met the Armada in the Channel and refused to play by the old rules. No grappling, no boarding, no brave men with swords clashing on blood-slicked decks. Instead, the English ships stood off at distance and used their superior maneuverability and rate of fire to harass, wound, and exhaust the Spanish fleet over a series of running engagements stretching from Plymouth to Gravelines. They could not sink the Armada outright, The range was still too great for the cannon of the age to penetrate Spanish hulls reliably, but they inflicted enough damage to keep the fleet from ever making landfall in the orderly way that the invasion plan required. The final blow, when it came, was not from English guns but from English fireships, 8 vessels packed with pitch and gunpowder and set alight in the dark of night, sent drifting on the tide toward the anchored Spanish fleet off the coast of Calais. When the Spanish captains saw those floating walls of fire bearing down on them, they panicked. They cut their anchor cables and scattered. Without their anchors, which could not be replaced, they could not hold a position or ride out a storm. And when the great Atlantic gales came in from the west, as they always do on that coast in summer, the Spanish fleet had nowhere to go but north, around the top of Scotland and down the western coast of Ireland, where the rocks and the waves tore them apart. 63 ships out of 130 returned to Spain. Thousands of men died not in battle but in the water, drowning or dashed to pieces on unfamiliar coasts. It was not a clean English victory. England's fleet had not destroyed the Armada in a decisive battle, but it was a decisive failure for Spain, and everyone in Europe understood what it meant. The greatest maritime power in the world had been turned back by an island that 20 years earlier had been considered a secondary naval player. If you find this story as gripping as I do, and I suspect you do because you're still here, then this is the moment to subscribe, because what comes next is the part most people don't know. The Armada is where most histories stop, but that was the beginning, not the climax. England had proven it could defend itself. Now it had to figure out how to dominate. The 17th century was the proving ground. It was a century of almost continuous warfare against the Dutch, against the French, against the Spanish again, and occasionally against itself in the form of civil war that overturned the monarchy, beheaded a king, and shook the foundations of English society to their deepest roots. Through all of it, the Navy endured and grew and changed. And through all of it, the fundamental challenge remained the same. How do you turn a large collection of wooden ships and ambitious men into a coherent fighting force capable of sustained operations across thousands of miles of hostile ocean? The answer, it turned out, involved bureaucracy as much as heroism. This is the part that rarely makes it into the popular imagination, but it is perhaps the most important part of the story. The great naval victories of the 17th and 18th centuries were not won by accident or inspiration alone. They were won because someone, somewhere, had figured out how to keep ships in service, how to find and train enough skilled sailors, how to provision a fleet at sea for months without putting into port, how to build ships that could survive a North Atlantic winter, how to establish dockyards capable of refitting a battle-damaged warship in weeks rather than months. The logistics of naval power, unglamorous and essential, were the hidden architecture of every triumph. Samuel Pepys, the great diarist, was also one of the greatest naval administrators who ever lived. As clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board and later as Secretary of the Admiralty, he spent decades fighting the corruption and incompetence that had plagued English naval supply since Henry VIII's day. He reformed the examination system for naval officers. He pushed for the standardization of ship designs that would allow parts and fittings to be exchanged between vessels. He established rules governing the stowage of provisions, the maintenance of rigging, the conduct of pursers who had been robbing the crown blind for generations. None of this sounds thrilling. All of it was essential, because without reliable supply and professional administration, the battles could not be fought. And there were battles. In the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the mid-17th century, England and the Netherlands, two Protestant maritime powers who shared a religion and a hatred for each other's trade dominance, fought out a series of naval campaigns that were unlike anything the world had seen before. The 4 Days Battle of June 1666 was the longest naval engagement in the Age of Sail, stretching over 4 days of continuous fighting, with losses on both sides that stagger the imagination. Hundreds of ships were involved. Thousands of men died. The sea between the mouth of the Thames and the Flemish coast was littered with wreckage for weeks afterward. The Dutch, under their brilliant Admiral Michiel de Ruyter, inflicted a significant defeat on the English. But England absorbed the blow, rebuilt, and came back. There is something important to understand about this pattern because it recurs throughout the entire history of British naval power. Britain lost battles. Britain lost individual campaigns. Britain sometimes lost entire fleets. What Britain almost never did was lose a war at sea, because the institutional capacity to recover, the dockyards, the finances, the trained manpower, the administrative machinery, was eventually more powerful than any single defeat. A nation that can build 10 ships for every one it loses, that can replace 1,000 sailors in the time it takes the enemy to replace 100, that can keep a fleet at sea for 6 months, while the enemy struggles to keep one at sea for 6 weeks. That nation has an advantage that no amount of tactical brilliance on the other side can permanently overcome. The Second Anglo-Dutch War ended in 1667 with one of the most humiliating episodes in English naval history. De Ruyter led a Dutch fleet up the Medway, broke through the defensive chain at Chatham, and burned or captured the largest ships in the Royal Navy where they lay at anchor. The sound of the Dutch guns could be heard in London. Pepys buried his gold in the garden and made arrangements for his wife to flee. But even this catastrophe, perhaps the worst single defeat ever inflicted on the British Navy in home waters, did not end the story. England signed a peace, reformed its defenses, and was back at sea within years. By the time the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the shape of British naval strategy was becoming clear. The key insight was one that seems obvious in retrospect, but was revolutionary in its time. Control of the sea lanes was not just a military advantage. It was an economic one. A nation that could keep its own merchant ships moving while preventing its enemies from doing the same could strangle a rival power in ways that no army could match. This was the doctrine of sea power, the idea eventually articulated by the American naval theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan in the 19th century, but practiced by British admirals long before he wrote it down, that command of the sea is the foundation of national power and prosperity. Britain's geography made this doctrine almost inevitable. An island nation has no choice but to depend on the sea. Every ton of grain, every yard of cloth, every barrel of tar and iron ingot that Britain needed and could not produce itself had to come by ship. Every market that British merchants wanted to reach was accessible only by water. The Royal Navy, from this perspective, was not simply a weapon of war. It was the guardian of British survival itself. This understanding drove everything. The Navigation Acts, which required colonial trade to be carried in English ships, were essentially a legislative expression of this naval strategy, a way of ensuring that British ships, British sailors, and British profits were at the center of the trading networks the Navy protected. The decision to invest heavily in permanent overseas naval bases at Gibraltar, at Halifax in Nova Scotia, at Port Mahon in Minorca reflected the understanding that a navy able to sustain itself far from home could project power in ways that a navy tied to its home ports never could. The gradual development of the copper-sheathed hull, which prevented the shipworm from destroying wooden ships in tropical waters and dramatically extended their operational range, was a technological expression of the same strategic imperative. But none of this existed in a vacuum, and it is worth pausing here to ask why you should press that like button right now. Not because this documentary is asking you to perform a hollow gesture, but because if you're genuinely absorbed in this story, that tells you something important about why history matters. The decisions made by a handful of men in the 17th century shaped the world you live in. The trade routes Britain fought to control became the arteries of a global economy. The naval technology that seemed merely tactical had consequences that ran centuries into the future. This matters, and it gets more intense from here. The War of the Spanish Succession, fought between 1701 and 1714, was the first of the great 18th century conflicts in which Britain deployed naval power on a truly global scale. The strategic prizes were Gibraltar and Minorca, two Mediterranean fortresses that gave the Royal Navy a permanent presence in the heart of European waters. and British sea power played a decisive role in determining that the Spanish Empire, in its weakened post-Habsburg form, would not fall entirely under French control. The Battle of Malaga in 1704, the largest naval engagement of the war, was fought by nearly 100 ships aside in the confined waters of the western Mediterranean, and while it was tactically inconclusive, it confirmed that the Royal Navy could operate effectively in waters far from home. Gibraltar, taken by a combined Anglo-Dutch force in August 1704 and held against Spanish counterattack, became one of the most strategically significant pieces of real estate in the world. That rocky, 2-mile-long peninsula controlling the entrance to the Mediterranean was worth more to British naval strategy than a dozen ships of the line. It was the key that could lock or unlock the entire inland sea. Every European power understood this. Every European power wanted it back. Britain held it through wars and sieges and 3 centuries of international pressure, and holds it still. The 7 Years' War, which broke out in 1756 and consumed virtually every major power in the world, was the moment when British naval dominance became something qualitatively different from what it had been before. This was not simply a European war. This was the first truly global conflict, fought simultaneously in North America and the Caribbean, in West Africa and India, in the Philippine Islands and the waters of the North Atlantic. Britain fought France and Spain and their allies on every ocean. And it won. The architect of this extraordinary success was William Pitt the Elder, one of the most clear-eyed strategic minds ever to hold power in Britain. Pitt understood, with a certainty that his political opponents thought was either genius or madness, that the war would be decided not on the plains of Europe, but on the sea. He poured money into the Uzubasa Navy. He sent expeditions not to reinforce the traditional European campaigns that British governments had always prioritized, but to attack French colonial possessions everywhere he could reach them. While Frederick the Great's Prussian army tied down French land forces in Europe, British naval expeditions seized Guadeloupe and Martinique in the Caribbean, captured Gori in West Africa, took Senegal, and, most extraordinarily, supported Robert Clive's operations in India that effectively ended French influence on the subcontinent. The year 1759 has been called Britain's Annus Mirabilis, its year of wonders. In the space of 12 months, British forces won victories at Lagos, at Minden, at Quebec, and at Quiberon Bay. At Lagos in August, Admiral Boscawen caught a French Mediterranean fleet trying to break out into the Atlantic and destroyed it. At Quiberon Bay in November, Admiral Hawke pursued a French fleet into the stormy waters off the coast of Brittany in conditions so violent that his own navigating officers begged him to haul off. The French ships knew the rocks. The English ships did not. A lee shore in a November Atlantic gale, with darkness coming on and the surf breaking white all around, this was not where a rational admiral should fight a battle. Hawke went in anyway. The Battle of Quiberon Bay is one of the most viscerally dramatic events in the age of sail. Ships running before a storm that was almost capsizing them, firing broadsides at close range, crashing through mountainous seas that were breaking over their gun decks. 2 French ships were wrecked on the rocks. One was swallowed by a wave so enormous that she simply vanished. But the French fleet was destroyed. The last serious French attempt to mount a naval invasion of Britain, which would have landed troops in Scotland to support the Jacobite cause, died in those winter seas off the coast of Brittany. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, Britain had acquired an empire of breathtaking scope. Canada, Florida, several Caribbean islands, dominance over the Indian subcontinent that would prove more consequential than anyone at the time fully grasped. The French Navy had been reduced to a shadow of itself, its ships rotting in harbors that lacked the money for maintenance, its trained officers dispersed, its institutional knowledge eroding with every year of peacetime neglect. Britain, by contrast, emerged from the war with a navy larger, more experienced, and better administered than at any point in its history. But here is where the story takes a turn that should give anyone pause. Power, unchecked, is never quite as absolute as it appears in the moment of its greatest expression. And in the decade after the 7 Years' War, Britain made mistakes that very nearly undid everything. The American Revolution is not primarily a story of naval warfare, but sea power runs through it in ways that are not always appreciated. When France entered the war on the American side in 1778 and Spain followed in 1779 and the Netherlands in 1780, Britain found itself fighting a global coalition with a navy that, for the first time in a century, was genuinely overstretched. The French Navy, rebuilt in the years since 1763 with focused investment and institutional reform, was no longer the shadow force it had been at the end of the 7 Years' War. It had new ships, competent officers, and something it had not possessed for a generation: confidence. The Battle of the Chesapeake in September 1781 was not the largest or most spectacular naval battle of the age, but it may have been the most consequential. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse met a British fleet under Admiral Graves in the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, fought an indecisive engagement, and then, this is the crucial part, Graves withdrew to New York for repairs while de Grasse remained on station. By doing so, the French fleet cut off any possibility of British relief or evacuation of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown. Without the ability to resupply or reinforce by sea, Cornwallis had no choice. He surrendered. The war in America was effectively over. It was a salutary lesson. The loss of the American colonies shook Britain to its core, provoked a crisis of confidence that went all the way to the top of the political establishment, and forced a reckoning with the real costs of maritime overextension. But if you think that reckoning produced permanent humility, you do not know the British Navy. What it produced instead was a period of intensive reform and rebuilding that would prepare the service for the most demanding test it had ever faced, because Napoleon was coming. The Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, which stretched from 1793 to 1815, were in every meaningful sense a war for the future of the world. On one side stood France, wielding the most formidable land army in European history under the most gifted military commander of the age. On the other side stood Britain, a nation that had been fighting French power off and on for a century and had developed, almost in spite of itself, a military culture of extraordinary resilience. What Britain had that France could never quite match was the sea. And what France had that Britain could never quite match was the land. This fundamental asymmetry shaped everything. Napoleon could defeat any European army in the field. He did so, repeatedly, with a systematic brilliance that still astonishes military historians. But he could not defeat the Royal Navy. He could not cross the Channel. He could not cut Britain's trade routes. He could not prevent British money and British subsidies from continuously rebuilding the coalitions that his armies demolished. The wars, ultimately, were a contest between a sword and a wall, between offensive military genius and defensive economic and naval power, and the wall held. Britain's strategy in these years was essentially what it had always been, refined to a point of ruthless efficiency. Blockade the French and their allied ports, disrupt their trade, support any power willing to fight them on land, strike at their colonies and trade routes wherever possible, and maintain, at whatever cost, the supremacy of the Royal Navy over every sea in the world. The blockade was the instrument through which this strategy operated. For years at a stretch, British ships maintained station off the great French naval bases, Brest, Rochefort, Toulon, in conditions of extraordinary hardship. The ships could not put into port for months. Sailors lived on salt meat and hard biscuit, their gums swelling with the beginnings of scurvy, their clothes rotting in the constant damp. The western approaches to France are not kind waters in winter. The Atlantic swells come in off thousands of miles of open ocean, and the gales that blow between October and March are among the most sustained and savage on Earth. Keeping a fleet of wooden sailing ships on station in those conditions, in the dark, within sight of a hostile shore, for month after month after month, was a feat of seamanship and institutional discipline that no other navy in the world was capable of replicating. Admiral Lord St. Vincent, who commanded the Channel Fleet in the years around the turn of the century and later served as First Lord of the Admiralty, was one of the most demanding officers who ever flew his flag from a British warship. His standards were absolute. His punishments for failure were severe. But his ship stayed at sea when every logic of weather and human endurance said they should come in. And because they stayed, the French fleets behind those blockaded ports never had the opportunity to train in open water, never developed the seamanship and gunnery skills that only come from sustained time at sea, and gradually fell further and further behind the Royal Navy in the quality that most determines the outcome of naval battles, the ability to fight efficiently in the chaos and noise and terror of close engagement. This is not a glamorous story. There is no single battle here. No burning ships and dying heroes. It is the story of ordinary men enduring extraordinary conditions, because the alternative was unthinkable. And it deserves as much recognition as any of the glorious engagements, because without it, the glorious engagements could never have been won. The Battle of the Nile in 1798 was the first of the great Nelsonian victories that announced to the world that the Royal Navy had reached a new level of operational capability. When Nelson tracked the French fleet to Aboukir Bay on the Egyptian coast, where they lay at anchor having transported Napoleon's army to Egypt, he found them in a position that most admirals would have considered too dangerous to attack at night. The French ships were anchored in a shallow bay, with shoal water on one side that seemed to preclude any attack from the shoreward direction. Their admiral, Brueys, believed himself safe until morning. Nelson attacked at dusk. The key insight that unlocked the battle came from one of Nelson's captains, who reasoned that if the French ships had enough water on their seaward side to swing at anchor, they had enough water on their shoreward side for a British ship to sail between them and the shore. Several British vessels did exactly that, attacking the French fleet from the landward side where their guns were not even run out, because nobody had imagined an attack from that direction was possible. Caught between two fires, the French vanguard and center were annihilated. When the French flagship Orient caught fire and exploded in a detonation that shook the earth for miles around, sending a column of fire visible for 30 miles into the Egyptian night, it was the most spectacular punctuation mark in the history of naval warfare. Napoleon's army was stranded in Egypt, cut off from France, eventually to wither and surrender without ever fulfilling the grand strategic design its creator had imagined for it. Those of you who have been watching the full length of this documentary deserve a moment of credit. This is a long journey and we are approaching its culmination, but I want to make sure we understand what we are describing before we arrive there. So if you haven't subscribed yet, and please do, because there is much more history on this channel that deserves your attention, and what is coming in the next few minutes is the most important part of this entire story. The years between the Nile and Trafalgar were years of mounting certainty on both sides. Napoleon, who had become Emperor of the French in 1804, understood with perfect clarity that as long as Britain stood undefeated, his empire was not secure. He could dominate the continent. He could reorganize the legal and administrative structure of Europe with the Code Napoleon. He could make kings of his brothers and marshals of his generals. But he could not end the war. Britain was an island, and the water around it was British water. And until he found a way to change that, the war would continue. He tried everything. He tried the continental system, an attempt to starve Britain economically by closing every European port to British trade. It hurt Britain. It hurt Europe more. The British simply found alternative markets, shifted trade flows to South America and elsewhere, and watched as the continental system created resentment and economic suffering across the continent that eventually turned Napoleon's client states against him. He tried building a new fleet. He poured resources into the French and Spanish navies, attempting to create a force large enough to control the Channel for long enough to transport the army waiting at Boulogne across to England. He nearly succeeded. At certain moments in 1804 and 1805, the prospect of invasion was real enough to generate genuine fear in London. But in October 1805, off a headland in southern Spain, it ended. We began there. We return there now. But with everything we have learned since those opening moments, with the full weight of 3 centuries of building, of reform and failure and recovery and triumph, so that we can understand Trafalgar not as an isolated event, but as a culmination. Nelson's tactical plan for the battle was simple in conception and terrifying in execution. Instead of the conventional approach of sailing parallel to the enemy line and exchanging broadsides until one side gave way, he divided his fleet into two columns and drove them directly into the enemy line at right angles. This meant accepting devastating punishment during the approach, as ships under helm could not bring their broadside guns to bear. It meant chaos once the line was broken, with individual ships fighting at close range in the dense smoke and noise that made formal signals impossible. It meant trusting his captains to fight their individual ships with full initiative once the battle became a melee. It meant, in short, that the quality advantage the Royal Navy possessed over its opponents, the superior gunnery, the faster rate of fire, the seamanship bred of years at sea, would tell most powerfully in the close, confused, killing work that followed the initial breakthrough. It worked exactly as he had calculated, and it cost him his life exactly as he had probably calculated as well. The aftermath of Trafalgar was not primarily emotional, though the emotion was real and enormous. The nation grieved Nelson as perhaps no military commander had ever been publicly grieved before. His body came home preserved in a barrel of brandy. The sailor's story that it had been drunk on the way home is almost certainly apocryphal, but almost certainly impossible to disprove, and lay in state at Greenwich before a funeral procession up the Thames to St. Paul's that drew crowds of such size and sorrow that the city seemed to have stopped breathing. But Trafalgar was primarily strategic. With the combined fleet of France and Spain broken, the threat of invasion was permanently removed. No French admiral would ever again command sufficient force to challenge the Royal Navy for command of the Channel or the Atlantic approaches. Napoleon, recognizing this, turned away from the sea entirely and focused on land, with consequences that ultimately destroyed him. Britain, with its sea lanes secure, continued to fund the coalitions that eventually wore down the French Empire and finished it at Waterloo in 1815. The peace that followed Waterloo opened the most extraordinary period of British naval dominance in the entire story. The Pax Britannica, the long 19th century peace enforced by the power and presence of the Royal Navy, was something genuinely unprecedented in world history. Britain emerged from 20 years of nearly continuous warfare as the only power with both the will and the capability to project sustained force across every ocean in the world. The French Navy had been shattered and would take decades to recover. The Spanish Navy no longer existed as a meaningful force. The Americans had a small but aggressive navy that would eventually become Britain's successor as the dominant sea power. But in 1815, they were still a regional power of limited reach. The Russians and Prussians were land powers. The Dutch had never recovered from the wars of the 17th century. There was simply nobody left. The Royal Navy in the decade after Waterloo maintained well over 100 ships of the line, thousands of smaller vessels, and hundreds of thousands of sailors and officers whose entire professional identity was built around sea service. It patrolled trade routes that connected every corner of the world. It suppressed piracy in the waters around Britain's expanding colonial empire. It conducted the campaign against the Atlantic slave trade, one of the most morally complex applications of naval power in history, pursued with genuine commitment over decades regardless of the economic costs, that eventually strangled the trade routes between West Africa and the Americas. The enforcement of anti-slavery patrol was not a simple or comfortable business. The ships were small, the climate was lethal, and the legal framework was often inadequate. Officers who intercepted slave ships found themselves navigating a maze of international maritime law while trying to save the lives of people who had already endured conditions that beggar description. Hundreds of Royal Navy officers and sailors died in the West Africa Squadron from tropical disease, drowning, and the occasional violent confrontation with heavily armed slavers. They continued anyway. Over several decades of sustained patrol, the squadron suppressed a significant portion of the transatlantic slave trade, freeing tens of thousands of people who would otherwise have crossed the Atlantic in chains. That story, which receives far less attention than the battles and the empire building, is part of the complete picture of what British naval power actually was. It was not simply a machine for projecting aggression and accumulating wealth. It was also, at certain moments and with genuine cost, an instrument used to enforce a standard of human conduct that Britain had decided, however imperfectly, was worth fighting for at sea. The technology was changing throughout this period, and with it the nature of sea power itself. Steam came to the ocean in the 1820s and 1830s, at first in the form of paddle steamers that were useful for towing ships of the line out of harbor, in a calm but were fragile and unreliable as independent fighting vessels. The screw propeller changed that calculation dramatically. By the 1840s and 1850s, screw-driven steam warships were beginning to appear that combined the reliability of steam propulsion with the hull forms and armor of traditional warships. The HMS Warrior, launched in 1860, was the first ocean-going, iron-hulled armored warship in the world. A vessel so far beyond anything else afloat that she made every existing wooden ship in every navy on Earth immediately obsolete. Britain led this transition, not by coincidence, but by systematic investment and deliberate policy. The same industrial revolution that was transforming British society and economy was also transforming the capacity of British dockyards to build, equip, and maintain warships on a scale that no rival could match. The iron foundries of the Midlands, the coal fields of Wales and Yorkshire, the engineering workshops of Glasgow and Sheffield, all of these fed into the war machine that kept the Royal Navy at the technological frontier throughout the 19th century. When other powers began to build modern iron warships, Britain was already building better ones. This pattern of innovation and advantage had been running, with occasional interruptions, for 300 years. The numbers tell the story in their own cold way. By the 1880s, the two-power standard, the official British policy of maintaining a navy at least as large as the next two naval powers combined, required a fleet of remarkable size. In 1889, the Naval Defense Act provided for the construction of 8 battleships, 38 cruisers, and a large number of smaller vessels, the largest single naval building program in history to that point. The money was found, the ships were built, and Britain sailed into the 20th century with the most powerful navy the world had ever seen. But numbers alone do not capture what 300 years of naval supremacy had done to Britain and to the world. The sea had become so central to British identity, that heart of the empire. The phrase "Britannia rules the waves" was not simply a patriotic slogan. It was an assertion of an identity forged in the salt air of 3 centuries, in the rigging of warships and the holds of merchant vessels, in the surgeons' cockpits where sailors died, and the gun decks where they killed, in the long watches of the night running before a North Atlantic gale with nothing between the hull and the bottom but 30 fathoms of black water. And the world that British naval power created, the world of enforced free trade, of safe passage for merchant ships, of anti-piracy patrols and anti-slavery squadrons, and the slow, contested emergence of something like international maritime law, was not simply a British world. It was the world. The global trading system that provides the foundation of modern prosperity moves goods across seas that British sailors bled and died to make usable. The international maritime laws that govern shipping today have roots in the prizes, treaties, and judicial decisions of the age of British naval dominance. The very assumption that no single nation should be able to close the sea to others, an assumption so fundamental to modern international relations that we rarely stop to examine it, was established and enforced at enormous cost by the people and the ships and the institutions whose story we have been following for the last 3 centuries. What does it take to build a world-spanning empire of the sea? It takes ships, yes, and guns and trained sailors and navigational knowledge and money, enormous amounts of money. But it also takes something harder to quantify and harder to replace when it is gone. It takes the willingness to send men into situations from which they may not return. It takes the discipline to maintain a watch in a storm that seems certain to kill you. It takes the courage to sail your ship directly into enemy fire, because an admiral's plan requires you to absorb the broadside before you can return it. It takes the stubbornness, generation after generation, to look at defeat and decide not that the sea has beaten you, but that you have not yet learned enough to beat the sea. Britain had that quality. Where it came from, whether it was the geography of the island, the economics of trade, the culture of a seafaring people, or something stranger and harder to name, historians have debated for generations and will continue to debate. But what it produced is clear. It produced the longest sustained period of naval dominance in recorded history, and a transformation of the world that we are still living with and still trying to understand. Nelson is gone. The Victory rests in dry dock at Portsmouth, preserved as a monument, still carrying on her gun deck the brass plate that marks the spot where the greatest sailor of the age of sail fell to a French musket ball on the most important afternoon of his life. The ships that followed her, iron ships, steel ships, nuclear submarines, have transformed the technology of sea power beyond recognition. But the principles that Nelson embodied and that the men and women of the Royal Navy embodied across 3 centuries are not obsolete. They are simply translated into new forms. The sea still does not forgive hesitation. Power still flows to those who control the maritime arteries of global trade. Nations still rise and fall on the quality of their institutions, their willingness to invest in capability before they need it, and their ability to learn from defeat without being destroyed by it. Britain learned all of that the hard way. In burning ships and flooded gun decks, and the dark waters off Quiberon Bay, in the Chesapeake in defeat, and the Nile in triumph. In the long, cold, miserable watches of the Western blockade, where sailors who nobody would ever remember kept their stations in weather that should have driven them home, because they knew that the security of everything they loved depended on their staying. The waves still break on the headland at Trafalgar. The sea that ran red on that October afternoon in 1805 is blue again and indifferent, as the sea always eventually becomes indifferent to the blood that has been shed on it. But the world those sailors made, with their courage and their suffering and their extraordinary, improbable skill, endures in ways that reach every corner of the globe. Britannia ruled the waves, and the world has never been the same. If this story moved you in any way, if the burning ships and dying admirals and lonely blockade watches struck something in you that deserves to be marked, then leave a comment telling me which moment in this 300-year saga you found most extraordinary. Was it Drake on the ridge in Panama looking at an ocean he had sworn to sail? Was it Nelson on the quarterdeck, metals gleaming, refusing to hide? Was it the unknown sailor on watch in the western approaches at 3 in the morning in a gale that was trying to kill him, holding his course because he had nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but his duty? They are all, in their different ways, the same story. They are all Britain and the sea, which is to say they are all the story of how the modern world was made. And that story is far from finished.